thing if I use really so uncoordinated to do that. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to the CTM festival. And I'm going to talk pretty softly. You know what? Can you turn down the bass a little bit? Yeah, that'll make it easier. It'll sound better in the room. So I want to thank CTM, Jan Rolf, Lily, Ebert, Dorothea, everybody connected with this, and all of you. I guess, yeah, this is sort of a long-winded talk, so I got to make sure it doesn't go over, I don't know, whoa. It doesn't go over 40 minutes or so, just telling you it's going to be that long. And this little thing, this is for those who are into the old days of analog synthesizers, this is a Serge modular system. You know, Serge Cherepnin, one of the Bay Area designers, along with Don Buchla, and he was selling these things as kits. So you got the kit with a bunch of resistors and stuff, and you had to build it. So I built this, and and then I did a bunch of concerts with it. But this was before I started working with computers. This might have been 77 or so. But I've been programming computers since about 78, that's 88, 98, 08. That's like 40 years. That's a really long time. And even well before that, I remember having pretty animated discussions with a lot of people, like my friend and colleague Douglas Ewart, about what you could do if you had a computer. Wow, and what would you do with that? We had no idea what we would do. We hadn't even seen anybody who had a computer. And the last thing I remember was they had a computer in my school as a kid, and they had us programming Fortran. I was just a terrible Fortran programmer. It was just the worst. But then again, I was in the 6th grade. But, they had these cards you had to put in, talking about this endless talk about do loops and all this. But anyway, things got a little easier, but not really. Around about 1979, started to actually put on performances with the first versions of what I've been calling creative machines. And so this here, you can see this on the screen. This is the very first kind of public performance of one of those. And this gives me a chance to do a sound check as well. This is an early monophonic microphone synthesizer. This thing on your, I guess here, that's a single board computer. Those 3 big chips, the middle one I think is the actual microprocessor. The little chips over here, that's the memory, 1024, 1K bytes of memory, not 1 megabyte, but 1 kilobyte, 1,000 bytes. And you wrote everything in that, and then the little keypad you used to do the programming of the machine in what was called machine code or whatever it was. So that's really how I started, and this was the very first thing that came out of that. Let's see if it works. That was just a little snippet of it. It went on for a while. It was a live performance at the Kitchen in New York. Yeah, that's. It wasn't listening to anything. It took a lot for me to just figure out how to get the thing to generate melodies. And I think the model for it, I was playing at the time with Anthony Braxton, and so the model for the computer program sound was Dave Holland, the bassist, and he thought that was pretty funny when I told him. Sort of like, you remember that, you guys don't remember any of this, right? These old reel-to-reel tape recorders, like 3-inch reels that they had way back in the day. I had one of those. I recorded my mom, and we played it back, and I said, "Mom, that's you." And she said, "That doesn't sound anything like me." I said, "Yeah, Mom, it sounds like you." I mean, she was really offended. I mean, the thing really didn't sound like her. You know. Now, you can compare this. This was 1979, as you can see there. You can compare this with this song from 2016, which was created with a neural network that was fed a recording of a lot of songs. According to Google, this is part of their Magenta project. The neural network soon begins to recognize, what note should come next in a sequence, and it eventually learns how to generate entire songs of its own. And this is one of its first songs. So there's some similarities there, I think, between the two works, around about 38 years apart. And this lets me talk about something. This is not an artist talk. I'll talk about my work, but there are a lot of other important things to talk about. I think more important than my work. But I did write this in 2000 about musical computer programs. Which, like any texts, are not objective or universal, but they instead represent the particular ideas of their creators. As notions about the nature and function of music become embedded into the structure of software-based musical systems and compositions, interactions with these systems tend to reveal characteristics of the community of thought and culture that produced them. Now, that was in 2000, or we can compare that with what anthropologist of technology Lucy Suchman wrote in 2007. Projects in AI and robotics evolve a kind of doubling or a mimicry in the machine that works as a powerful disclosing agent for assumptions about the human. They make evident how roboticists imagine humanness. Yes, and really not even just roboticists. As recent public misadventures in machine learning have shown, the example of Tay, which I imagine you've all heard about, the Microsoft Twitter chatbot, whose tweets quickly devolved into racist, sexist, homophobic, and even genocidal diatribes before being taken offline, shows effectively, if inadvertently, that machine learning isn't just about the machine, but about the machine as part of a social world. And there's more related to the social. Over the 40 years I've been working with creative machines, reception from both musicians and audiences has varied widely. Some people like it, some people didn't like it, so on. But one ongoing issue, and one I've never quite been able to put to rest, was exemplified by frequent conversations with audience members, musicians. It started off a bit like this. Why do you want to play with computers and not with people? Well, that's a good question, actually, and you can't just dismiss that by saying, oh, you're a Luddite, you don't know anything about technology, computers are cool, blah, 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 You can't do that. I mean, and a lot of the people who would ask that question, they weren't reading books on post-humanism and all that. And anyway, there was no post-humanism. And when I started doing this, nobody was talking about post-humanism. And so for people who hadn't really drunk the cybernetic, Kool-Aid, placing computers on stage with other people to play music, and then it seemed like you were really denigrating the people, and that was a real problem. No, you were crossing a certain line. It was like a transgressive act. And I think Lucy Suchman, again, expresses this fear in terms of a project to replace the biological individual with a computational one. And that's a successor to the now ubiquitous transformation of the nature of work that began really in the Industrial Revolution and gained new urgency, in the 50s, the late modernist technosphere, where you were constantly being told you will be replaced by a machine. This This particular slide refers to a project that, I don't know if they have it here, they have it in the US, where professors send their papers to a computer to be graded. And so there are lots of petitions against that. Noam Chomsky and many other academics are opposed to this, and it seems there are good reasons why. But it becomes clear that, as the theorist and interactive artist Simon Penny argues, it is true that categorically new kinds of cultural practices have emerged in which the machine system is constituted as a quasi-organism which responds to changes or perturbations in its Umwelt. Nothing in the theoretical corpus of the fine arts prepares one for the task of designing an artifact which behaves, and I think it goes further than that. The digital aesthetics, even in what we've come to know as digital aesthetics, I think the idea of evaluating or thinking about the aesthetics of interactive systems seems very much in its infancy, even after all this time has elapsed. But about 18 years ago, I'd been doing it for a while, and I managed to articulate at least one rationale for my work. I said, this sounds a little pretentious. It says, this work deals with the nature of music, and in particular, the processes by which improvising musicians produce it. Well, I do want to know about that. These questions can encompass not only technological or music theoretical concerns, but philosophical, political, cultural, and social concerns as well. Now, the thing is, though, by this time, I'd gotten used to the fact that not everybody wanted to address these concerns. I got an email. I was working on another book, and I got an email. They were quoting a musician in Downbeat magazine, and the musician told an interviewer, George Lewis is working on another book that is about improvisation in daily life. Well, I guess that's what he thought it was. I hadn't even started it, really. Anyway, and parsing the mental processes by which we make spontaneous decisions. It's not so mystifying, even in our dialogue. We draw upon our vocabulary, our experiences, our associations, and we spontaneously speak to each other. I think that happens in music, but there's a particular mindfulness to the craft of that in music. Maybe that's the mystery, and it should remain a mystery if it's beyond what we can say in words. And the interviewer said, well, I'd be disappointed if we could actually map spontaneity. Well, I'm kind of used to that. It's the arts-oriented notion of improvisation as something that's ineffable. You often find the ineffable when people really can't say or don't want to say what's really going on. They resort to the ineffable. But in other words, that's actually a strategy for achieving a certain kind of art world success. It has many variants. If you have to ask, you'll never know. That's one of them, which is very famous in the jazz world. And so I found myself leaning away from the idea that I should pose as one of the dynamic, selected band of super people with powers and abilities far beyond those of everyone else. And that would be the basis on which I would explain what I do. In other words, I don't have to explain it. I'm just an authority, and you have to accept what I say because of my genius, So, in fact, nowadays, in much of the music we hear in the West, sounds electronic anyway, or at least electronically enhanced, and programs that play music are actually pretty commonplace now in certain ways. However, it seemed, once again, to many that there was just something wrong with the notion of computers as improvisers. There was something special about improvisation, something essential, something fundamental to the human spirit. And you really couldn't or really shouldn't approach that with machines. Now, I heard that this was a day for you all are thinking about new technologies, and I imagine that actually maybe not that many of you share this unease about computers and improvising. But if you do, let me tell you that very little of what I'm going to say will be very reassuring. I'm not planning to spend very much time discussing the concerns of people who don't want their computers to improvise. We can talk about that later. Rather, I want to sketch out some of the basic reasons why, despite all the odds, some perverse individuals, and indeed entire communities, persist in wanting their machines to improvise. But we might want to begin by asking why people improvise. A recent essay by the performer scholar Ali Jihad Rasi addresses this very question right in the title of his essay, Why Do They Improvise? He notes, among other things, that improvising has been viewed as a metaphor for freedom. Improvising is recognized as it's an integral aspect of human nature. So how might these and other aspects of the improvisative experience, I know that's a hard word, improvisative, I made it up myself, you know. It's neologism, be worked out in the realm of machine-human relations. Well, there's this idea I heard about from Malachi Favors, who's pictured here in two different versions, the great contrabassist of the Art Ensemble of Chicago. And there's this idea that's very consistent of music that somehow plays itself or emerges from a non-human intelligence. And that's a common theme in folklore as well as science. And Malachi used to talk about this African brother who had instruments that played themselves. Now there's a similar point of view in the book a lot of you have probably read by Francis Bebe on African music. He describes an incident where an accomplished musician, after trying an instrument briefly, hands it back to its owner and says that, I can't play this because it doesn't speak the same language that I do. So Bebe further maintained that in some African societies, a musical instrument is often regarded as a human being. So what this does, it enacts the metaphor of communication between two subject intelligences. In other words, the instrument is not an object to be manipulated. It's actually a subject to be addressed in the same way that we would address other subjects, such as ourselves. So this way of conceiving human, non-human relations seems congruent with my assertions from 2000 of I'm calling performance with creative machines, quote, parallel streams of music generation, emanating from both the computers and the human, non-hierarchical, improvisational, subject-subject model of discourse. Or we can look to Suchman, who says that in the constitution of the human-machine interface, subject-subject interactions involve forms of mutual intelligibility. Watch out for that. That's something we want to get to later. Mutual intelligibility, intimately connected with, but also different from, the intelligibilities involved in relations of subject and object. And this is a particular form of collaborative world-making, she says. And this derives in part from Bruno Latour's observation from the perspective of actor network theory that objects have agency too. So there's more on this business of the human, non-human but human-like intelligence. This construction of musical automata, I want to talk about that briefly. This is an automatic flute player that was constructed by the Musa brothers in Baghdad in the 9th century in their Book of Ingenious Devices, which has recently been republished, and you can read it. I think Springer published it. It's very interesting reading. Or you can think about this guy, 18th century German musical culture, the notion of Begeisterung, okay? Routinely translated in English as enthusiasm, but it's a lot more than enthusiasm, Geist, it denotes a dynamic paroxysm of creative ecstasy, somebody who got the Geist, they got the spirit, right? So theorists seeking an understanding of human creativity, were very interested in Beethoven's sketchbooks as a primary artifact of the immediacy that was central to Begeisterung, but everyone thought that Begeisterung was most centrally found in improvisation, and as you know, Beethoven was a super improviser. In fact, he would go on the gig and he would say that, well, I don't want to play any of my pieces, I just want to improvise, you guys play the pieces, And of course, improvisation was a necessary aspect of a musician's training. So Johann Georg Sulzer, this nice fellow here, in his Allgemeine Theorie der schönen Künste, 1771, General Theory of Fine Arts, he proposed that we would be able to hear Begeisterung in Beethoven's improvisations if we'd been there. And he understood that inspiration proceeded not only from the music itself, and not only from somebody looking at it, from a perceiver's response, somebody listening to it. And he was very excited about an English builder's plans, 1749, for a piano that would convert, Fantasien, they called them, right? Improvisations, that would be able to listen to, record the Fantasien, and write them out in music notation. So they've been working on that for a pretty long time. They still don't have it quite working, but it's something that, let's say, yesterday's Yamaha Disclavier would be sort of involved with. Now, and this is Terry Adkins. It's a piece called Black Beethoven, which I sped up for your viewing pleasure. So there are a bunch of entrants in this business of musical automata. There's the Vaucanson, Frenchman's 1737 flute player. Most people know Vaucanson for the shitting duck, which was another thing he made. Mansetti's flutist from 1840. Then later we have Friedrich Kaufmann's 1810 trumpet player. And then we have another trumpet player made by Meltzow, the metronome guy. He had a trumpet player too. And a bit earlier, the Joueuse de Tympanon de Marie Antoinette's dulcimer player, built in 1784 and presented to her a year after it was built. This is kind of fun.
Et voilà cette magnifique tympanon, un chef-d'œuvre du musée des arts et métiers.
On va voir un peu le mécanisme de la joueuse sous sa robe très fragile. Voilà, j'espère que vous le voyez.
This is weird, I know.
L'originalité de ce mécanisme, c'est que, contrairement à ce qu'on imaginerait d'une boîte à musique, on imagine un rouleau avec des picots, là c'est beaucoup plus compliqué, ce qui fait que c'est véritablement l'automate qui va jouer de la musique. Donc c'est un système assez complexe. Bon, alors c'est le résultat de tous les travaux, au moins du XVIIIe siècle, sur la mise en mouvement des objets, voire même la tentative d'imitation du vivant.
The whole idea of imitating life, the mimicry aspect, and all of these devices show the desire for, in Pamela McCorduck's phrase, machines who think. But often enough, that desire is portrayed as ultimately malevolent. Czech writer Karl Čapek's 1920 play, R.U.R., was far from the first such representation, but his play gave us the term robot to refer to human-built and human-enslaved artificial people who eventually smash up the place, like the Golem or Frankenstein. They smash up the place, they use the sentence they acquire, they threaten good order, and Rossum's universal robots, RUR, in fact, eventually destroy the human race. And I could say a lot more about RUR. Robot comes from the Czech term robota, which is a system of sort of like sharecropper, the sharecropper type system. Land, a certain ownership of land, and peasants who work it, the peasants were called the robota, and that's where the term comes from. Or we can consider John Stuart Mill, who asks in his classic On Liberty, supposing it were possible to get houses built, corn grown, battles fought, causes tried, and even churches erected, and prayers said by machinery, by automatons in human form. Now, the irony of this 1859 passage might have stood out in the waning days of chattel slavery in America. In the colonies of Mill's native Britain, formerly a central participant in the slave trade, slavery had been abolished a quarter of a century before Mill wrote this. Now, of course, for U.S. slave owners, perhaps their property were indeed automata in human form. And I want to follow up on this implications of this derivation of robot from the Czech word. Suchman's assertion that the figure of the humanoid robot sits provocatively on the boundary of subjects and objects, threatening its breakdown at the same time that it reiterates its founding identities and difference, that seems to recall the figure of the American black slave who also sat no less provocatively, no less discursively on that boundary. The theorist Fred Moten's observation that, quote, the history of blackness is testament to the fact that objects can and do resist, recalls the actor network theory notion of the performative object, except that by object, Moten means black Americans under the condition of slavery, who were defined as commodities, but commodities who spoke. So I'm pursuing this line of discussion to give you a sense of what is at stake in the discussion of machines and improvisation. The notion that improvisation is inextricably bound up with the articulation of human freedom seems utopian, but the condition of slavery, which would obviously represent the most extreme constraints on improvisation, actually people improvise just as much, if not more, and serves as a powerful counterexample. Despite the best efforts of U.S. society, improvisation persisted, a fact that tells us that freedom's locus is in the mind as well as in the body. So here, improvisation as resistance becomes the mark of agency, as Moten speaks of, quote, the improvisation through which the opposition of spirit and matter that is instantiated when the object, the commodity, sounds. So sound becomes the mark of subjective agency as much as anything else. So we can consider here Thomas Wiggins, here, the 19th century virtuoso American pianist, widely known as Blind Tom. The Harlem Renaissance philosopher Alan Locke's account of Tom's abilities recalls the young Mozart. He could play flawlessly any composition he heard played, usually on hearing it just once. He could improvise correctly and expressively, and is said to have had a repertoire of several thousand pieces. A contemporaneous account gives us Moten's sounding commodity. Our readers will remember a recent news item giving an account of a musical prodigy in the shape of a blind Negro boy owned by Mr. Oliver of Georgia, which, the property, plays the piano intuitively with surprising power. Imagine that, property playing the piano. A friend who knows Mr. Oliver writes the following enthusiastic account. The boy is an ugly little nigger till he touches the piano. Then the sightless eyeballs seem to be searching in the stars, and the great opera ear seems to be catching harmony from the celestial spheres. I never heard such power, such emphasis, such marvelous fingering, such sweetness, and yet this is an ugly little cornfield nigger of Georgia. Now, this is from Blind Tom's 1863 work for piano, The Battle of Manassas, one of the decisive encounters of this American Civil War. You hear the sounds of thunder, lightning, and cannons via cluster-like sounds that anticipate by more than half a century early Henry Cowell and the work of the futurists. For Moten, Moten says here that the truth about the value of the commodity is tied precisely to the impossibility of its speaking. For if the commodity could speak, it would have intrinsic value. It would be infused with a certain spirit, a certain value given not from the outside. And as I think about it, the object speaks, it transcends its objectification, and practices of improvisation have become bound up with that intrinsic value. Now, Blind Tom, you just heard him speaking here. Many other oppressed peoples have spoken through music to assert their humanity, while those in opposition sought strenuously to deny the worth of those expressions as a means of denying that humanity. Thus, it comes as no surprise that computer artists would assert deeper exploration of what it means to be human by creating human-like musical devices, machines that sounded and behaved in socio-musical ways. Chopek's play is often interpreted as a critique of scientific irresponsibility, but it seems clear that a major danger Chopek's characters saw with the robots is that, like Blade Runner, they were able to pass as people. Chopek's robots pursue imposture as a survival tactic, and the analogy to racial passing is too obvious to ignore. As Irving Goffman, the sociologist, noted in the 50s, the more closely the imposter's performance approximates to the real thing, the more intensely we may be threatened. For a competent performance by someone who proves to be an imposter may weaken in our minds the moral connection between legitimate authorization to play a part and the capacity to play it. Or as new media artist Antoinette Lafarge put it, to talk about imposture is to talk about personhood and social identity. That turn in our discussion allows us a brief excursion, you all know about this, about Masahiro Mori's notion of the uncanny valley, which asserts that as the behavior of robots becomes more and more human-like, visually in Mori's formulation, we're thinking sonically here, a point arises at which they become less familiar to us and more uncanny, even to the point of invoking aversion. Now, it occurs to me that this phenomenon extends well beyond our encounter with robots toward any substantive exchange with entities previously regarded as subaltern objects who suddenly begin to speak. In the context of electoral politics, Barack Obama's ascension to the US presidency may be viewed as an example. Some partisans have continued, despite all evidence, to regard his occupancy of the office as simple imposture, again evoking the uncanny valley and extreme aversion. Among many others, Lucy Suchman has explored notions surrounding the fascination of AI with humanoid robots. Here's an example for human subjects that one day might be able to pass.
Hello, Leo. Leo, this is Cookie Monster. Can you find Cookie Monster? Leo, Cookie Monster is very bad. He's very bad, Leo. Cookie Monster is very, very bad. He's a scary monster who wants to get your cookies.
Mimesis seemed the guiding impulse behind the earliest experiments in computer music composition. As the breathless headline of a 1959 article in Scientific American by computer music pioneer Jaron Hiller put it, information theory makes possible the programming of a computer to compose music. The process by which the machine does so throws light on musical structure and on the methods of human composers. And he goes on to talk about how the machine works, flow charts, random integers, and so on. And what we've got here is that we need to really, at this point, conceptually migrate away from Suchman's engagement with explicitly human or bodied robots. Theorists are intensely concerned with the fate of the body under techno-scientific regimes, but for many years, computer music comes from not from what Catherine Hales would call mind bodies, but really from non-bodies, speakers, robotic musical improvisers. It's the immateriality of sound rather than the construction of physicality. That becomes the context for mimetic analogies to human subjectivity, autopoietic, interactive musical behavior, operating both independently and in dialogue with listeners, viewers. That's not a simulation of musical experience, but music making itself with real-world outcomes and other spheres of human endeavor. Now, I promised to get into the geek world for just about 5 minutes, so bear with me. I promised a couple people I would do this because of last night's concert. Maybe everyone wasn't there, but you might have heard something similar. There's a lot of stuff on YouTube about this. So here are my kind of general principles for what I do when I make interactive musical systems. First, human and or non-human musicians, in other words, they could play with each other or with other systems like them, engage in live, completely improvised dialogue with a computer-driven, interactive, quote, virtual improviser. It's really just an improviser. It's not virtual, really. Second, a computer program analyzes aspects for the musical environment in real time, using that analysis to guide an automatic, quote, improvisation program. Well, you could call it a composition program. I mean, they don't know the difference. The program generates both complex responses to input and independent behavior that arises from its own internal processes. The system should respond differently to different musical behaviors. Fourth, the system can generate music without outside input. It doesn't need you to play. When it detects outside input, it takes what it finds into account as part of its decision-making process. So here's a romp through memory lane. By 1983, I was working at IRCOM, doing stuff like this in the fourth programming language. So you can see these things. Actually, it's on the IRCOM website. You can download these videos, ancient videos. And this resulted in a work that was premiered at IRCOM way back in 1984, Rainbow Family, chamber music interactive work of 3 Apple computers and 4 human improvisers. The improvisers were Joël Leandre, who we'll see in a moment, Steve Lacey, Douglas Ewart, and Derek Bailey. So that's a bit of baffle-gab about the piece, which was translated into French. There's a whole thing that says there, for example, la structure de Rainbow Family comprend la fois des éléments improvisés et précomposés. Well, that part wasn't true. I decided I wasn't interested in pre-composed material. So the whole thing is just the improvised part of that is true. But, it was IRCOM, right? You had to do something pre-composed, and they didn't, couldn't tell the difference anyway. So the thing was, well, and the people who could tell the difference thought it was great. Anyway, let's hear some of it. What do you think?
I'm well.
Yeah.
I'm well. I listened to well, I don't know. What do you think, you?
I don't have anything to think. I'm just trying to figure out what you might need or want in the way the machine's playing. What do you think? Anything?
Control the machine. Try like a game.
It's like a game.
Yes.
Like, I'm just interested in like how you feel interactionally.
Well,
It's cool.
yes.
Okay. So 10 years later, I started embarking on, actually 87, the sort of Voyager system sort of superseded the rainbow kind of architecture, and sort of what people follow this, they know as Voyager came along. By 94, Voyager performed music with up to 64 separate MIDI channels, a kind of virtual orchestra with a human soloist. It still followed the principles. It drew features from its environment. It self-organized its behavior according to a structure that's summarized here as, I found this somewhere, the mind map of the system. Sort of like phrenology. Unlike Rainbow, the Voyager system could produce multiple rhythms, parallel streams of contrasting musical behavior, orchestration complexes, microtonality using hundreds of scales, and so on. So this is one example, and there'll be another one later. This is what a part of the code for Voyager looked like in 1994. This is the hardware. So in 2004, we jump ahead another 10 years, got a commission from the American Composers Orchestra. We sort of flipped the script. They called me up and they said, well, we would like to involve the orchestra with improvisation. I said, that sounds pretty good. So what do you want to do? It says, well, we were thinking about having the orchestra improvise. Well, I suppose you could do that. I mean, the thing is, that's a whole other conversation about the problems with that. And it's not some genetic, inability. It's socially constructed like everything else. Certainly they can do it, but there has to be a community of people doing it. So they said, well, look, maybe you could play with the orchestra, improvise it. I don't want to do that, but I know someone who can. And there's something, not quite sure which, who can. And I told them my plans, and they went for it. So I made a new version with an improvising piano soloist with a human orchestra, reverse of what you saw before. And both the pianist and the work made their debut at Carnegie Hall, and this pianist is the basis for the player some of you heard last night. So it does what, once again, the principles. had microphones placed in the orchestra so that the system could hear what the orchestration was, and it just found its way from there. Some of you saw last night that some people thought it was pretty funny when the piano was playing and I went off stage. Well, there was nothing for me to do. The piano was it was perfectly capable of playing the concert. I didn't need to be there except in case I went and made one adjustment, and that was I want to hear how it sounded. But for the performance, for this piece, I was sitting in the balcony, so I was just like everybody else. Say, turn it on, and it'll operate from there. You won't need to do anything else. So I thought back and listening to this kind of thing, whether, if I decided to start all over with a Google-style machine learning algorithm, I could play it a lot of Roscoe Mitchell recordings, and then eventually it would learn to play like Roscoe Mitchell. That may have been, I'm not really sure, the last time Roscoe played with one of my systems before last night. I'm not sure. We'd have to verify that. We will later when we have our conversation in just a few minutes. Because, sure, I could get one of these learning algorithms together, play at a bunch of Roscoe's records, and pretty soon it'll come out sounding like Roscoe. Well, that would be pretty useless to him. In fact, he might get mad about it. I can hear him saying, why doesn't this thing get its own thing, man? Why do you have to lean on me, That's an African-American way of looking at the world of music. You get your own voice, They all talk about it. Everybody talks about it. And then the idea to come out with a Roscoe lick, it'd be like, well, there's this whole thing, don't imitate me. So when I play with Roscoe, I try to stay out of his way. If he's playing one thing, it ends up being so seductive, you feel like I must play this same thing. And then you say, nope, can't do it. You might kill me if I do it. So I try to provide contrast and counterpoint. That's the strategy. Maybe it's successful, we'll find out. But when I started, usable neural network technology was about a decade in the future. And anyway, I was more interested in developing methodologies for creating my own music, what I thought was compelling music, maybe which is different from what Google thinks compelling music is. So now, in a sort of a long conclusion, I want to pose that question again. Why should I want my computers to improvise? Well, for the philosopher Arnold I. Davidson, he says this: collective intelligibility unfolds in real time when the participants in social interaction are committed to making sense of and giving sense to themselves and others. Thus, when our machines improvise musically, they allow us to explore how meaning and ethics are exchanged through sound. To improvise is to counter alternative points of view and to learn from the other. Improvising with computers allows us a way to look inside these and other fundamental processes of interaction. So, in this regard, creative machines that take part in collective musical improvisations exemplify this radical position of Lucy Suchman: I take the boundaries between machines, between persons and machines, to be discursively and materially enacted rather than naturally affected, and to be available for refiguring. Now, this leads me to my final point: establishing a ground basis for recognizing the presence and power of improvisation. So up to the late 20th century, most scholarly commentary on improvisation in the West concerned traditional artistic media, centrally music, dance, theater, so on. In the last decade, however, there's been a surge, as you can see here, of interdisciplinary inquiry on improvisation across both artistic and nominally non-artistic fields to form the emergent meta-field of critical improvisation studies. You see some of the fields here: anthropology, sociology, political science, computer science, economics, and so on, gender and sexuality studies. These are all fields in which significant work on improvisation has been done. And a lot of it has nothing to do, they have no investment in artistic histories or ideologies. They don't think about music. So in critical improvisation studies, the arts are just part of the network, tracing the entire human condition of improvisation. And so after doing this work for a good long time, I came up with 4 kind of characteristics that I like about improvisation that I feel that I can live with. Why do I want my computers to improvise? Well, I feel that my work with computers and non-human agency brought me to the point where I can theorize this practice in terms of 4 fundamental characteristics. 1 and 2, we are all agents operating in a continuous condition of indeterminacy. We cannot fully know what will happen next. 3, we analyze our environment for clues as to where we are and to seed predictions to where we are headed. This includes imaginings of past, present, and future. And number 4, we make a choice. So think about it: agency, indeterminacy, analysis, choice. See, it's a very low bar for improvisation. A lot of stuff's not in there, like style or will or aesthetics. All that stuff, I threw it out. Because, if I have to talk about improvisation as an everyday life characteristic, and I include the aesthetics, that must mean that everyone is an artist when they live their daily lives. We know that's not true. A lot of people don't want to be artists. So that would exclude them, and there's no reason for it. So this is a sort of I'm trying to make characteristics of improvisation that don't depend on artistic models for their being. So I say here that these elements will be found in any improvised act whatsoever, whether by people or machines, or for that matter, the animal kingdom or a plant kingdom or slime molds or whatever. So I'm freeing, as I look at it, the concept of improvisation from musical and artistic models, allowing invocation of both the personal and the social on a broader basis. So that's about the book that we recently published, Oxford Handbook of Critical Improvisation Studies, some of the things that are talked about there. So I just want to say that this is my idea of why a great improviser, machine improviser, is, the Mars rover. Or self-driving cars. Now, of course, there's a lot to be said about both of these. They're country cousins, of course. But these technologies show us, among other things, as Philip Agre said, the computer scientist, activity in worlds of realistic complexity is inherently a matter of improvisation. By inherently, I mean this is a necessary result, a property of the universe, and not simply of a particular species of organism or a particular type of device. In particular, it is a computational result, one inherent in the physical realization of complex things. And this gets me in touch with, allows me to invoke two artists, Marvin Minsky and Lester Bowie. Marvin Minsky, a virtuoso pianist, Lester Bowie, virtuoso trumpeter, and one of the members of the Art Ensemble of Chicago, who was somehow, Arnold Davidson found this quote, "Artists teach people how to live." And so that's what we're, in a way, here to do. Marvin was a virtuoso pianist and devotee of musical experimentalism. He was also one of the first to propose musical improvisation as a gateway to understanding larger issues of knowledge representation. He also connected AI with the social, and this is the book Society of Mind that does that. So I'd like to conclude with another observation by Davidson. What we say about human-computer interaction is all too frequently dictated by an already determinate picture of the boundaries of the possible and the impossible. When one is pushed to go beyond already established models of intelligibility and habitual practices of the self, when one searches for new forms of self and of social intelligibility, new modes of freedom, the improvisatory way of life assumes not only all of its ethico-political force, but all of its very real risks of unintelligibility and collapse. Negotiating this complex matrix, that's part of why many of us want our computers to improvise and why we want to improvise with them. What we learn is not only or most importantly about machines, but about ourselves and about how we get along. Should be enough for now. Thank you.